Welcome to the Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. This episode tonight brought to you, as all episodes, by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Check them out today at Roll20.net. Follow the show on Twitter and Facebook, SWGM Podcast. Follow us on YouTube and iTunes under the same moniker, SWGM Podcast. We've done rebranding. Dun, dun, dun. Tonight,
clear and easy to understand, Jared.
Thank you. Tonight, Jib, we need to talk to each other after the show. I'll need to see you after the show. Tonight, we are proud to have the creator of a Kickstarter on the show and a returning guest of the show.
Thank you.
Eli Kurtz. Oh, not you, Chris. Shut the fuck up.
Oh.
So let me do the introductions because, somebody threw me off. Tonight, as always, Chris, the Savage Mommy Fox.
Hello.
Dave, the Rules Maven Scott.
Greetings and salutations.
Some call him Jib.
Yep.
And our special guest, Eli Kurtz. Oh, Kurtz! Damn it!
Hello.
So tonight we're...
producers have asked me to talk to you about this. Yeah, they need to have a meeting with you after the show.
I will turn this podcast around. I will shut that shit down. Yeah, I have. It's called verbal aphasia. Look it up. Google that shit. You'll figure it out. I can't be the only one who's familiar with the fast method or the smell of burnt toast as part of this podcast. So tonight we're going to be talking Blackwood, and we have the creator of the setting with us. Blackwood is currently on Kickstarter. They are at currently a little over, actually coming close to 3,000 of a 5,000 goal with 25 days to go. So we're here to talk about the setting with the creator of the setting, novel concept. Go ahead, Eli. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the setting is, what makes it unique for Savage Worlds?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me on. Good to be here with you guys again. Second of all, the Blackwood already. I figured I'd get it out of my system. So the Blackwood, you find yourself in a forest that is a combination between Grimm's fairy tales and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. I was inspired by things like the Witcher series, Brotherhood of the Wolf, Hustle, old Jackie Chan, Jet Li, Bruce Lee, Kung Fu movies, and that sort of thing. So it's a real mashup, but it works, it turns out.
Unlike, you could have gone pirate, but you didn't go pirate. Thank God. There wasn't, you didn't go with the pirate setting. So I think one of the things that I think we want to just kind of highlight for the viewers, anybody watching, if you want, you can participate in the live streaming YouTube event chat. Chris will be monitoring that and answering any questions again tonight.
Me again?
Yeah, it's because I just like to see that look of panic.
You keep telling me this
look of panic.
You keep telling me this shit, and I still don't know how to do it.
So if you want to ask Eli any questions directly, feel free. Dave, why don't you go ahead and handle that for Chris?
Thank you.
Eli's actually in the chat, so he's chatting directly. So he's handling some of those questions. But yeah.
Nice to have a competent host.
Hey.
Okay, so one of the things that I find interesting.
We could ever get this damn thing on Twitch, it'd be much easier.
Oh, that hurts.
Ooh,
that really
shots fired.
That really hurts.
The Monster Hearts episode.
Chris, words hurt, man.
Sorry about that.
Next week we'll be holding a eulogy for Chris the Savage Mommy Fox.
Season 14, episode 2, we're gonna sit Shiva.
So there's
last poor Chris.
Yeah, I'm not gonna be here next week, so if I'm not, please let my mom know that I've been murdered by the other hosts.
Okay, I'm gonna need you to set up a video feed, leave it running, sign into the show way early on. And then we'll just need just your cap and your headset in frame.
Okay. Perfect.
So to get back on topic, back on track, one of the things that Eli mentioned early on, one of the mixtures of the setting is a heavy martial arts setting. And I don't think we've necessarily had a Savage World setting to date that is heavily a mixture or heavily influenced by martial arts that I could think of.
I know there's one in production for Steamscape Asia, but I don't believe that's actually out in the wild at all, is it?
Well, the Steamscapes Asia core book, I actually played a game with Eric up here in Chicago not too long ago, Eric Simon. And it's got a really cool fighting school system. I actually took a little inspiration from it whenever I was working on the Blackwood. The major difference is that Eric spent a lot of time researching specific real-world martial arts and recreating those with, so his stuff is really cool for seeing, like, what's it called, Gatka, what the Sikhs did in India, their style, doing some specific Japanese or Chinese arts or something like that. My system is definitely more of the high-flying wuxia martial arts stuff. So you're not necessarily going to see karate, but you'll see boar school, which is kind of like a hard offensive style within the Blackwood and that sort of thing.
So just to be clear, I want to make sure I'm understanding. So you've kind of created some styles that are truly for the Blackwood. They're not recreations of real styles, but they're going to be heavily influenced and they're going to have a certain feel to them that's reminiscent of the wuxia you would see in a lot of the old wuxia pictures. Whereas it's not named, the Drunken Monkey or karate or any of that.
Right. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. So there are 9 styles that we've got, and of those 9, 3 of them are considered advanced or secret or hidden techniques or something. So you have to progress a little ways in one of the schools before you're eligible to take this secret style. So for an example, you might start studying in Red Bear school, which red bears are these creatures that are kind of mixes between raccoons and red pandas, and they're just these little agile thief type animals. And so the Red Bear school is based on striking a lot and being mobile. So you get a bonus to doing agility tricks in the Red Bear school. You get abilities where you can do multiple attacks at once, that sort of thing. And then you might eventually, once you progress far enough in that, study what's called the Way of the Gourd, which is exactly drunken boxing. And the idea, as far as those mechanics are concerned, is to capitalize on the overreach of your opponent. So if your opponent attacks you and misses, you get a free attack against them. If they, like, you can do something where it's almost like a counterattack mechanic, but instead it's more like your body is absorbing the blow and you're acting off of that momentum.
But at no point does the character ever drop into doggy style. I have to apologize. I'm reading this directly from YouTube comments.
Correct. There is currently no doggy style. I'm not much of a dog person. I prefer cats.
That's just wrong.
So, Dave, why don't you read what you dropped here in chat with the plot point campaign real quick?
Okay, so Alec Muzi asks, Eli, does your product contain a plot point campaign? And if so, can you talk us through the creative process you used to come up with a plot point campaign? And the second half of that, I think, is a very loaded question. But
yeah, totally. Well, first of all, it does have a plot point campaign. And the reason why I wanted a plot point campaign is because I like the idea, like Savage Worlds was cool to me because I could pay $10 and get all of the rules I needed to be able to play in the system. And I love that value, right? And by the same token, a lot of the campaigns or settings that I see coming out these days are a setting book, and then you've got a separate GM's book, and then you've got a plot point campaign that's attached to it. And I didn't want people to have to pay that much money on all those different things and stuff. So it was important to me to have the setting book and the plot point in one volume, like 50 fathoms or something like that. And this plot point, called The Way of the Elder King, follows one of the central mysteries of the setting. So the idea is that the Elder Kingdom is this realm inside the Blackwood, and it's the only way that humans have been able to survive in the forest that is magically super active and wants to snuff out civilization and encroach on everything, right? And the Elder Kingdom is protected by the Elder King, who has ruled, his family line has ruled for the past 1,400 years. And 14 years ago, he disappeared. And since then, the nobility forgotten their duties to the common people, and the forest has started to act up more, and it's caused villages to collapse and the survivors to flee to walled cities that are getting crowded. So there's a lot of corruption and stuff like that going on. And like I said, the plot point campaign pursues the mystery of what happened to the Elder King. And if there's a way to maybe bring him back or save the Elder Kingdom in spite of whatever may have happened to him. And so whenever I came up with this plot point campaign, one of the major settings for the Blackwood is folklore. And so I looked at a lot of Grimm's Tales. I read most of Grimm's Tales. I looked at a lot of Chinese folklore. I looked at a lot of early American settlement folklore. And from there, I kind of cooked up all of these ideas, melted them together, and came up with something. So, for example, the climax of the plot point campaign, where you finally, the whole mystery of the Elder King comes to full fulfillment here. A German operetta, and I won't spoil it for anyone, but if you want to search through your catalog of German operettas when you get home, maybe you'll find which one the plot point campaign is inspired by. But yeah, throughout, so there's one adventure that's in the middle of the campaign where basically you have to go play in a tournament and become a champion in order to get what you need to move forward in your quest. And the tournament is inspired by the Olympics, because the Olympics are such an American pastime, right? And they've been around for so long. And so you've got the summer games and the winter games sort of, and you have two tournaments where you could win this if for whatever reason you failed the other one. Adventure that's inspired by the Boston Tea Party. That's actually one of the free one sheets that's available. And so this is the kind of thing that I did as I was going through and writing the plot point campaign. I would try to find some kind of real world example and then figure out a way to represent that in the Blackwood.
Now, I guess you mentioned some of these adventures kind of belong maybe in the middle or toward the end of the plot point. Is this closer in style to an ETU where there's a series of kind of one sheets and single story Savage Tales, along with kind of a structure of these happen in the beginning of the beginning of the plot point. These happen, the second year, the third year, the fourth year. Or is it more of the 50 Fathom structure where it's literally tell it in whatever order you decide?
Yeah, well, it's I suppose it doesn't have to be sequential, but I did write it to be sequential. So there are 9 core adventures in the plot point campaign, and then beyond that, there are about 20 or 30 Savage Tales that you can go on. And some of those are really short things that are basically here's something that typically happens in the Blackwood, and you come up with your own details to flesh out the rest of this session. And then there are some that are full 1,200 word, intended to be 4 or 5 hour adventures that are fleshed out and have a lot of nuance in them. And so there is a lot of variety there. But so for the plot point campaign, for example, the first 2 adventures are played back to back, and they're a crash course for the setting and the stakes of the plot point campaign. After that, the next adventure doesn't start for a few months afterward. You have to be seasoned before you can start that adventure. So the adventure pace for the core plot point adventures are gated in that same way.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I kind of like the fact that the first 2 build off of one another. So and that's something that we haven't done in my pirate setting, which by the way is kickstarting May 16th. So if you are interested, go back Blackwood, and then May 16th come and back Buccaneer Through Hell and High Water. So
okay,
right. In fact,
Jesus Christ, we get it. You have a Kickstarter too. Jesus,
I do.
All right.
I do. May 16th, a week from next Tuesday.
Okay, guys, you heard Savage Mommy. You're allowed to back the Blackwood, but only if you then turn around and back.
Them's the rules.
Right. That's what I said. Yeah, that's exactly what I said. Just in not so many terms.
Yeah. Well, Chris Savage Mommy's the king of the Kickstarter stuff. So you get the rules is rules. Rules is rules.
That's right.
The way it is.
There you go.
So Can you talk a little bit more about the fighting schools, like how they're mechanically? Maybe it'll be a little bit more of a mechanical. Is it done as an edge? Are they more of a skill tree base? How do you
so
kind of like structure the fight?
I actually took this show's advice when working on part of the fighting schools, because I noticed, as you guys had pointed out, that there aren't really any edge trees in Savage Worlds. And if there are, it's like you have this one edge and then there's one edge that you can get on top of that. And I understand the design behind that at this point. I think it's a pretty smart idea to not lock people in if they want to really aspire to something. But in this fighting school system, there are 4 different edges that you can potentially take. The first one is aspiring student, where you choose one of the 9 schools and you unlock the first tier ability for that school. The second one is worthy student, where you unlock the second edge, or the second ability in that school. The third one is master of the school, where you unlock the final ability, and master of the school you can take when you're heroic. And it allows you to circumvent the rest of the requirements for the sidekick edge, so that you don't have to wait until you're legendary to start taking on like a pupil of your own.
Nice.
And then the fourth one is hybrid schools. And so if you've progressed to at least worthy level in one school or 2 schools, then you can take this edge, and it allows you to have both abilities active at once. Otherwise, you would have to choose between which school you're using at any given time, which you can change as a free action.
So how do you pull off the, okay, so let's say I'm a high kicking and I'm gonna call it Wuxia because, well, you know,
no problem.
High kicking Wuxia master. How is it an arcane background that I'm taking combined with an edge for the school? Is it handled as a skill test, an edge? How do you pull off? How do I in Blackwood as a character pull off the fight 8 guys surrounding me at once, double flip over run up the side of a tree, double flip, run along the side of a wall, come back down, and beat the crap out of 8 guys standing around me? How does that work in the setting?
Totally. Well, first of all, the actions you described would take place over the course of maybe 2 or 3 turns. But you could definitely double up a bunch of them to create a pretty frenetic combat experience, right? So first of all, the running around on the walls, doing all the flips and that sort of thing, that would be best represented by the leaf step edge. And that is emulating the light body skill of wuxia people. So like Limu Bai and all those people flying around and Crouching Tiger and Dragon, they're using the Blackwood equivalent of leaf step. Means the edge itself is written, it says, whenever you take the run action, you can move over any surface, basically like the wall walker monstrous ability. And then
Nice.
you have to end on flat ground. But if you're in combat, not only do you get that ability, but you also get a free agility trick. So if you take the run action, you can dive into combat, do your agility trick to knock people or to mess people up. And then on your next turn, you could take an attack action. Now, let's say that your school, the example I gave earlier, the Red Bear School, right?
Mm-hmm.
The aspiring ability for the Red Bear School is Way of the Twisted Branch. And what that means is that you gain +1 to agility tricks, your pace is increased by 1, and your running die increases by 1 step. So if you have Way of the Twisted Branch active and Leaf Step, then you can move really quickly and get a huge bonus to your agility trick. Whereas if you're worthy in the same school, you also gain the 100 Claws Strike, and it reduces your multi-action penalty by 2 when performing an attack same round. So all of a sudden you can dive in, you can do your agility trick, and you could attack at the same time. And the idea with the Red Bear School specifically is to kind of just turn you into a tornado of movement and claws. You would still suffer, penalties to withdraw from combat, but it makes you a real handy striker or like a glass cannon type.
And that's all accomplished through the edge levels in the school, not an arcane background or a power or power
Correct.
points, right? Okay.
Yeah. And Leaf Step is the one that would be most likely to be a power instead. We actually went through a lot of iterations of that edge as we were trying to figure out how to represent that ability. It went from being an edge to being a power to being an arcane background all on its own to being more like a magic item, and then back to being an edge. Yeah, I think this is maybe like the 7th or 8th draft of that edge. We wanted to make sure we got it right.
I think it's pretty seamless from a mechanical standpoint, because all you're doing is just saying this edge gives you this additional bonus, and you don't have to track power points or do anything like that to do something cool. So
Right.
Kudos. I think it's a great implementation of the Fast, Furious, Fun, and Savage world, is do it as simply as you possibly can do it. And I agree with, we've had this discussion before on the show, with agility tricks. You know, the high flying, kicking stuff is more an agility trick, not intended to do harm, but to shake your opponent and make them to delay, cause a delay. So yeah, excellent.
Cool.
What is okay? So I'm seeing Blackwood on a buddy's shelf after a successful Kickstarter, where you go 10,000 over goal. It's proliferated everywhere. So I'm at a friend's house and they've got this. They're unboxing it, and I'm going, "Ooh, what's this?" And they're going, "It's kind of like fantasy meets martial arts, and kind of like grim." And I go, "Okay, awesome." I'm a D&D player, just gotten into Savage Worlds. What am I going to experience on the fantasy side of this that I'm not expecting to? Like, I'm expecting to see very effete and effeminate elves that are very learned and aged and composed and very social. Dwarves that are all grimy and curmudgeon-y. I'm used to Tolkien fantasy. I'm used to D&D. I'm used to that concept of a world. How do dwarves differ? How do elves differ? How do ogres differ? How do dragons differ? If there are dragons in Blackwood, what's the kind of set the table? What's the difference in fantasy stuff?
Well, I hate to break it to you. There are dragons, but there are none of the other things you mentioned. You're only going to be able to play as a human in the Blackwood. The idea being that in folklore, which is what inspired the Blackwood, you really only hear that from the human perspective. You don't hear folk tales about the dwarf who went out to conquer some evil. You hear folk tales about the little girl who met a dwarf in the forest and went off to go to fight the evil that she found or something, And so creatures, all of the fantasy races and things that you might experience in your typical fantasy game are things that you'll experience instead as encounters in this game. So elves are not they're not Tolkien, they're not Elrond, they're not having councils and forging mighty rings of power. They're jumping out of the forest looking not quite like a man or a woman, or not quite like an adult or a child, but maybe with like hair made out of leaves, and then all of a sudden they turn your friend inside out, and all of a sudden you're hovering over like a cauldron that's bubbling. These elves are Rumpelstiltskin, they're not Legolas. You might encounter something like dwarves, but instead of some sort of bearded miner type, you run into this goat-sized little goblin creature that loves to burrow and fights with crude bone implements or something, Being able to differentiate it from typical fantasy, that's probably the most egregious thing.
That sounds very familiar to something we did in Buccaneer Through Hell and High Water, which is Tuesday, May 16th. We don't have any. We're humans only as well, and we only allowed two arcane backgrounds. We allowed miracles and voodoo, so we kind of did the same thing. But your Rumpelstiltskin guys sound really kick-ass.
Yeah, absolutely. I gotta say too, this is my favorite guerrilla marketing scheme of all time.
it's called a running gag, ladies and gentlemen. Pre-play it before the show.
Yes, I'm not trying to be an asshole, but we do launch on May 16th, a week from Tuesday.
I'm not trying to be an asshole, but I'm just gonna pound it in here. I love
clap. Awesome.
I love the Eastern European focus, that Grimm's fairy tales style that you're doing, because it gets you more like the fae, the fairy version of the dwarves and the elves. And it's something that we don't see. You know, we see it a lot in mythology. You read an average European tale, you've got the elves in an Arthurian tale, or the Grimm's tales are not what we get from, like, you know, the Tolkien-esque thing. So I think this definitely gives people a flavor of something that just isn't out there. Because I think in all of the current incarnations of fantasy in Savage Worlds, at least, it's pretty carte blanche Tolkien fantasy. There's been some twisted stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong, Shane Tar absolutely sets a bar way high, and then you know, Hellfrost is absolutely its own creature. But this really is in kind of a class of its own. Then you're not going to kind of butt elbows with people who want to play Shane Tar for space at the table. This is going to give them a completely different experience.
Right, and I will say, you can play magical beings in the Blackwood. So there are two things in particular I'm thinking of here. The first one is a hindrance called Enchanted, and you can make it minor or major. If it's a minor hindrance, then either on the new moon or on the full moon, your choice, you turn into an animal because an elf has cursed you with this terrible affliction. And it could be like a heron, it could be a boar, it could be, you know, a wolf or something, but you are expected to play that character like the animal that it is. And that creates the hindrance. Whereas if it's a major hindrance, then it's going full Ladyhawk, and it's like for half of every day you are an animal. So that's one opportunity for you to play a creature that's pretty solidly magical. Another opportunity is one of the races that's available called Elf-marked. And even though you're a human, somewhere in your family history, an elf somewhere that meddled in your bloodline. And so you were born with like a tree stump growing out of your neck, or you were born with gigantic goat ears flopping down or something like that. And in a place that's as superstitious as the Blackwood, some pretty heavy penalties in terms of how you're going to be able to interact with the people of the world.
Nice. So this is more Germanic fantasy than it is European, like classical European fantasy. So, I mean, it's possible to have a situation where you mentioned Rumpelstiltskin as an example, an iconic example. You could also have doppelgangers, right? You could have the whole. You could have you could walk into a forest and find out that the trees are moving on their own because they're actually alive and moving around you, right? So you have like killer ents, to use a Tolkien type reference, even though it's not Tolkien. So you get like living tree branches, living trees, living forest. Is there any kind of I'm just going to go out on a limb here because I see what I did there, and because you're also talked earlier about having some American colonial American influences. Any Paul Bunyan-esque type lumberjacking?
Indeed. So actually, my partner in crime in this endeavor, Derek Smith, he's in the chat as Sabaker. He was part of our playtest campaign, and he created a character whose name is Jan, son of Jan, son of Jan, son of Jan, etc., etc. And Jan is a woodfolk or a woodkin, and he is this big, burly lumberjack dude who is really boisterous, and he imagines that he is followed around by a blue dog named Mutt. And he has now been canonized in the official book in a quest or two, because I was like, it's just too perfect. I mean, it's such a ridiculous character. This guy who, and the other thing about him, he imagines there's a blue dog following him around everywhere. And he will talk about this dog all the time, but don't you dare call him crazy, because that's a great way to get punched in the face. And so, like, this character is just audacious, and he's also a really nice kind of homage to American folklore without being literally Paul Bunyan in a fantasy setting. You know, that was one of the things we had to balance, was trying to figure out how to bring these icons into a world that's not ours and make them recognizable, but also give them a unique twist.
Well, since you brought up Saw, I do just want to point out the question that we got from him and Gary earlier in the show. They want to know what's going on with the beard and why they're just seeing a shadow and why you haven't actually grown it.
It's because I was tragically born without the ability to grow a beard, and it's been about a week. And here I am.
Oh, look at that growth.
Yeah, I know.
You call out
Almost-
people in the chat. I got to give them their day in court. So
Yeah, of course.
Well, why don't you ask him the other question that's in chat? Come on.
What's that one?
well, I mean, there's several stacking up here, Chris. You wouldn't happen to be talking about the very last one I put in, are you?
No, I'm talking about the one. I'll read the other one.
Okay.
Okay, it says, what was your inspiration for naming it the Blackwood, and how big is the Blackwood? Is it large and hefty, or is it just a small area in a bigger world?
Excellent phrasing, Hobo.
there.
It's a good question, though.
No less from Gary.
Actually, here, I'll show you this while we're on the video. It will be an exclusive for people who are watching tonight or who watch on YouTube later. So this is the map that we're going to have in the final edition. And you can see here, I'll put it up in front of the screen a little more. You can see we've got a pretty large area. We've got mountains, we've got rivers, we've got forest and different distinct cities and everything too, right?
You might want to pull it back about 2 inches.
Okay, sorry.
You got the entire northern center.
We've got a whole lot of areas to explore the Blackwood. And this is a map of the region of the Elder Kingdom. The Blackwood is maybe 5 or 6 times bigger than this. It's a massive forest, and this kingdom is pretty solidly cut off from the rest of the world. But there is a wider world out there. The Blackwood calls all of it the Wide Lands, but it's really an entire. So the world map is about the same size as a single hemisphere on Earth. It's not a round world; it's more of like a contact lens-shaped world. But yeah, it's a huge world, and it's got a lot going on pretty much everywhere. But the only part that interacts with the Blackwood is from the Wildlands called the Unified, a mashup of European Catholicism and African Yoruba religious traditions. And it's setting out on a mission to unify the entire world under its religious banner. And every now and then, it might not be okay if a country says, hey, we're good, stay out of here. So yeah, that's another potential point of conflict in the setting is what do these unified people want? And are they really as peaceful as they say they are?
So, and I want to ask, this is something that you could potentially release several additional plot points. Since this plot point is specifically the Elder Kingdom story, the Blackwood is a large enough setting, you could have other plot points that you could continue to expand into, obviously in success of the Kickstarter and you know.
Right. Well, you've got it half right. We do have other settings that we want to explore, but we want to expand them into full setting books. And one of the things we want to do that we don't see doing or happening in a lot of published worlds is that if they explore another region, it's in the same period in history. And what we want to do is have the Blackwood be like the medieval fantasy setting, and then the Widelands are a part of this setting because the next setting will be an exploration of the Widelands. And that's going to be kind of a Wild Western steampunk setting. And this is in keeping with the general arc of the campaign or the world intention to sort of like this is an exploration of settlement in a rough land, much like when Europeans came to North America to settle it. Empyrean will be a story about expansion through a wide frontier, and that's the steampunk setting that's going to be kind of Wild Western, but it's going to explore a different culture from the world. Then we're going to have yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so are you following kind of the Deadlands approach where you have Deadlands Reloaded and then you have Deadlands Noir, which is, you know, forward in time, but it's the exact same world. It's just we're projecting what would the natural historical progression be, and then you have obviously, you know, like I forget the one.
Lost Colony.
Yeah, Lost Colony.
Lost Colony. Yeah. That's exactly right. We've got everything planned from medieval fantasy all the way out to like a Z-Rust kind of far future space adventures type thing.
Cool. Jim, any questions?
I was going to ask if you would ever do a book or setting or expansion where the players got to play the game from this viewpoint of the Fae, of the elves and the dwarves and the.
Ooh.
and whatnot.
I've thought about that, and there are a couple of different ways that I've thought about doing it. So obviously, when you read a role-playing game, it sort of is written from the assumption that the players are going to triumph and they're going to be victorious in the end. The way I'm writing the plot point campaign is such that by the end of it, you will probably have a pretty good idea about where you should go if you were successful in your quest, what to do next, right? But I would really love to write a plot point campaign that's from the perspective of like, you have lost, and now you are playing as the pagans who are working on taking over the Elder Kingdom, and you are living in this dark world and sort of helping to spread darkness, and maybe something a little more, I don't know, necessary evil or something in that regard.
But that would be like an alt history version of your own world at that point, so that it doesn't mess up the later timelines that you're going to do for your more expanded settings, correct?
Yeah. It would be
this wouldn't be something that could be run kind of, one after the other and still follow that same timeline. This would literally be a flip flop of who won the I don't want to call it a war necessarily in the current plot point campaign.
Yeah. The central conflict of the plot point campaign. It would be, like you said, an alternate history thing where you explore what would happen if something else went down.
See, that would be interesting. And I know my players would look at a setting like Blackwood, and they would want to play the side of the Fae.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they would want.
Well, and you can definitely, already in the core book, there are options for you to play as a pagan. The assumption is that you would be a pagan who's kind of reformed and has left your culture and has joined the Elder Kingdom in their adventures. But all the rules are there where you could have a party of only pagans, and you could be doing their priorities instead.
So now, within the Blackwood, do you have any rules for sailing ships? Any kind of high seas adventures?
Yeah, there's this huge system for hurricanes. We felt like it's a fantasy forest. We should probably have sea battles involved.
Nice. Have you come up with your own ship combat rules? For instance, like what's going to be out in Buccaneer through Hell and High Water?
No, but you should tell me about that. That sounds intriguing.
Let's just say this: they are currently being play tested and reworked.
Wonderful.
Hopefully, it's time for the Kickstarter starting May 16th.
Yeah, like anything else, it's a you play test it, and I know you've probably done a ton of play tests. You said you had that one edge who went through so many iterations of trying how do I want this edge to come across, and that's really what we're doing right now with how we want to do ship combat is, how do we want to keep it fast, furious, and fun, but we also how do we want to make sure everybody on a ship has something to do during that combat. Mm-hmm. And I think we've come up with a way. I actually unfortunately had to work and I missed the last play test.
Yeah, we weren't serious about that, Chris. So, Eli,
well, no, I mean,
damn it!
To kind of follow on what Chris is saying, I know you said that it took 8 or 9 iterations for you to get Leaf Step right. Did you find there was anything else that in your play testing took a lot of iterations that you were doing because it was you were trying to fine tune it to get that Blackwood feel within the Savage Worlds mentality, or was this a really easy translation for you?
Yeah, it's been a pretty gradual process. There have not been so many times when we have found a mechanic that we just couldn't figure out, but throughout the process, we kept having different or new mechanics that would occur to us. So, for example, about 2 days before we launched the Kickstarter, I added one final setting rule to the setting, and that's called the Ways Margin. The Ways Margin is in the language of the setting. It's the world of errantry. It's where you have all of these harrowing adventures, and the idea is inspired by wuxia. In wuxia stories, the government is usually corrupt or ineffectual, and people are struggling. And the government is kind of deaf to their cries. And so this other class of people called the Shah have to rise up and they have to fight on behalf of the people, or if they choose to, just carve out whatever life they can for themselves. It's kind of an amoral underworld of society. A really good modern equivalent would be the John Wick movies, you know. So you've got this sort of mafioso underworld where these people are larger than life and they live by their own rules. The difference is that it would be taking place in fantasy China instead of modern day New York. But yeah, so one of the setting rules that we came up with just recently, the premise is that at any given time, you can have one vow to a random person. And as you're walking down the street in the middle of a session, you can say, GM, I want to swear a vow to this person to solve their problem that I'm going to invent right now. And in exchange for completing that problem, which should take 1 or 2 sessions for me to complete, I will get a benefit from them, like a favor that they owe me. And unfortunately, what that also means is that I'm going to get an enemy as a result of this too, because I can't help them without creating trouble elsewhere. And so it's this nature of cyclical violence that you see in wuxia, where these people have to go outside the law to be able to help people who need it. Going outside the law creates problems for them, even if it helps other people, and you have to deal with those consequences.
It sounds very akin to the Triple Ace Games contacts rules, where a player can just, within each adventure cycle, they can, one player can create a contact that they run into and can get a favor from. It sounds like you added something of that nature, but they have to kind of earn it by doing these vows to get to that point, and then it has this longer tail with this enemy that they develop. So is this something that you're trying to maybe sly away from the GM having to assign hindrances, and instead now the players can kind of add their own enemy hindrance by invoking this setting rule?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea is that the player says to themselves, I really want this thing to happen for me right now, and I'm willing to take on a little bit of heat for a little while to get it done. And the cool thing about the enemy hindrance in particular is that, you kill your enemy and that hindrance goes away. It can be a temporary hindrance. And so we wanted it to be the sort of thing where, like, yeah, you can do this thing that's good and you're going to suffer for a little while, but you don't have to suffer forever if you're willing to accept the additional consequences of doing what it takes to get rid of it,
Little Big Trouble in Little China kind of
feel. Yeah, exactly. Ancient grudges, climactic duels, that sort of thing.
So Saw kind of tackled this one, but I figure we'll give you kind of center stage on it here. Daniel, who really kind of warmed up to the idea of your setting as we've been talking, asks, playing as pagans, sowing the seeds of heresy. That sounds awesome. What are the prevalent religions of the Blackwood setting? How are you playing with kind of that religious aspect and maybe morality?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are. Most of the religions are tied to arcane backgrounds in one way or another. So like I mentioned, there's elven worship, where pagans are able to survive out in the wilderness that is really inhospitable by summoning an elf and saying, hey, I'll do what you want if you give me the power to survive here. And so it's kind of totemic magic in that case. And you can get power in exchange for it, but if you break a certain rule, or if you do the wrong thing one way or another, then the elf is going to show up and is going to wonder why you have bothered it, And that is something where you could even maybe broker an additional boon, but it's never something you should want to do. Attracting the attention of your elven boss is bad news. So that's one example of Blackwood religions. I also mentioned
what about ancestor worship? Because we had a similar question earlier on with it.
Oh, yeah. So ancestor worship, that's actually probably what would be considered the main religion of the Elder Kingdom. The idea is that by worshiping your ancestors and by remembering their legacy and holding them up in your daily life, they can help you from beyond the grave. And the most important way that they help the people of the Elder Kingdom is by pushing the wilderness back with this magical hedge so that people can have enough land to settle on and grow crops and build houses and that sort of thing. But that's an ambient world piece of information, even though it's important. The more mechanically relevant way for players to interact with the ancestors is with the arcane background, where you have a particular ancestor in your past who is known for something particularly awesome, and you get an arcane background power that's based off of that ancestor's life. And it works more or less like the superpowers arcane background, in the sense that you have 1 or 2 powers that you can use with regularity. Yeah, and in this case, it's just tied specifically to your ancestors. So that's the ancestor.
So I could have an ancestor. Okay, so as a player character, I could take the arcane background ancestor worship, right?
Yeah.
And then I could say I had a great uncle or grandfather who had the ability to pass unseen. And then that would just be part of his folklore. And then I would just, as a part of that, I would end up taking the invisibility power as a arcane skill. And then
that's exactly right.
Using it.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. And then the final religion in the Blackwood is the unified religion that I mentioned earlier. The general idea there is that the god of light and sound, his name is Arunial, he created everything. And all of the other gods in the entire world are secretly more like angels under his service. But whenever he created everything, it was so stunning that all of these angels fled from the splendor of the moment. And so it's the Unified's job to spread the word about Arunial and to encounter new cultures and say, hey, your gods are awesome and they're powerful and they're real, but who's their boss, right? And so you should worship your gods still, but you should use them to talk to this guy because that's the truth, you know? And so in that sense, it's a lot like Catholicism and the saint situation, and also like Yoruba with their Orisha and their whatever his name is. But yeah, and so mechanically speaking, that's really similar to the Miracles arcane background. That's your typical cleric kind of religion, you know.
That sounds like it follows kind of the actual like Celtic pagan tradition where they had Yesu, which was their mythological version of what ended up being the Jesus figure for Christianity. So I mean, it definitely sounds like you've put a lot of kind of research into borrowing from the real world. Have you borrowed any real world locations for the Blackwood? Are there places in the Blackwood that, you know, when someone reads about in your setting, they're going to go, oh, well, this is lifted right out of, you know, the North Saxon coast or the Eastern Polish wilderness?
Yeah, well, the one place that's probably most iconic is the spires, right? And let me see if I can show you guys this on the map. So these guys right here, they are karst topography after centuries and centuries, right? And so they're your typical, actually, the literal inspiration for them is Kung Fu Panda when they're fighting the snow leopard on the bridges above that misty thing with those spires. Like, that was the image in my mind when I was like, yeah, this needs to be a place in the Blackwood. But you see those mountains all over southern and central China. And so that sort of place is really immediately visually identifiable, right? But the other places that you would encounter that would be iconic are more like story elements that you'll encounter. So like I said, there's a town where in the free one-shot adventure, you basically play out the Boston Tea Party. And then in the actual plot point campaign, one of the Savage Tales you can go on involves crossing a river in the middle of winter to storm an overwhelming force and try and win the day, just like crossing the Delaware, right? So there are iconic events, you might say, more than iconic locations.
I had something, and then it went away.
I know. I saw that your eyes kind of went up, and you kind of had that look on your face just for a second, and then it went away.
It's just gone.
Well,
wind.
I'll touch on this one. A little earlier up. Excited to hear about your Kickstarter, given your reputation for strictly following the plot point campaign. How will your product work for the improv-friendly GM? I want to answer that to a degree, and then feel free to answer that as well. If you're an improv,
I think it's actually addressed to Chris, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, that one's actually directed to Chris because Alec is asking because
Oh, I'm
Chris has
sorry.
plugged, through Hell and High Water enough times that we're
I've
actually
been trying-
getting questions for that now.
I mean, it's about ships, seawater, and pirates. I mean, you don't really need a plot point campaign. I mean, come on, seriously.
No,
We're all
no,
improv, right?
and we're not doing one to start. At some point, maybe we might try to do. Even sitting here listening to Eli has kind of gotten me wanting to look at one, and so he and I are going to have to talk at some point so he can give me the lessons on how to do one.
Yeah.
But for the main book, it's not going to have a plot point campaign. It's just going to be the main book, and that's improv friendly right there, because you're going to have to come up with your adventures. We have an adventure, a 3-parter that we're going to try to put out, and I have a friend who is working on an adventure right now. So that's something else coming out, but no plot point right now.
So, Eli, what would an improv adventure look like in the Blackwood? An off script. What would we're going to sit down. We've already run through a plot point campaign, and we're halfway through, and you're just going to insert a savage tale in the Blackwood. What would be like, a very Blackwood tropey one shot or improv adventure setting?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so there are a couple of things, right? One of the things that's really iconic about folklore and about the Blackwood is hunting and tracking, right? So one of the savage tales says, hey, this is the general conceit is that there is a creature of some kind who is meddling in some location. It's either a village or a walled city or what have you. And it's your job to track it down to its lair. And so the adventure, you draw a card and you determine what the nature of the creature is based on the suit of the card. So for example, let me see here, I'll just pull up the quest. You pick a beast or a monster from the encounter lists and you treat it as a wild card. And then players have to track it down, and it's either going to be the case that it's out on patrol, or you can choose to try and track it down while it's on patrol, or you can choose to do it in its lair. And so that's enough to give you the skeleton of the adventure. It also says that if it's a lair, then there's usually some kind of treasure there. So you know what the inciting incident is, you know what the general arc of the adventure is, and you know what the ultimate reward is. And from there, you fill in all the details you care to do.
So it gives you a little story generator using a card-based system, generally speaking. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, there are 5 or 6 of those kind of kernel adventures that I've written, and they involve anything from hunting and tracking to doing a favor for a noble to searching out some ruined structure, whether it's a recent village or an ancient site, bringing some outlaws in for a bounty, that sort of thing.
Oh, I remember what the question was. It came back. So you mentioned dragons earlier. Yes, there are dragons in it.
Yeah.
What are the dragons like in Blackwood?
Yeah, well, dragons are so iconic in Western folklore and in Asian folklore, so I knew they had to be in there. I personally am kind of tired of seeing your typical winged dragon who can shapeshift and all sorts of the typical D&D tropes or whatever. And so this dragon instead is based more on the two sources, actually. The Chinese dragon, the lung dragon, and also American alligators. Visually, whenever we get the art done for them, I want them to look basically like a really long, really nasty alligator. And they're cool because they can emit this mist, like a reek from their bodies, and that reek allows them to float through it, right? So they can't necessarily fly, but if this mist is up, it provides cover, and it allows them to glide around within that mist. And then also they have something called a dragon pearl, which is this pearl that's about the size of a fist that they excrete in their mouths. And they can spit that out, and when it hits something, it explodes violently, but it's not actually destroyed. So there's actually, like, on the black market, you can pick up a dragon pearl, and it's basically a reusable fireball. But dragons are the ones who create it, and dragons are the ones who use it for that exact purpose, to keep you from being able to take it from them.
All right, I'm sold. Just right there, the concept for dragons, that is so unique in a fantasy. I'm done. I'm in.
Nice.
Sign up for the Kickstarter right there. It's worth it for that alone.
Well, Jared, you could go take the last remaining top tier reward, which I'm going to pitch to Eli here for a second for him to really kick this off. So Eli, you're actually offering your Kickstarter backers the option to pay a little bit more, and you'll run them through an adventure online for them and a friend.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the highest tier. It's $250, and I'm pleased to say that my parents took the first one, so all y'all suckers just gonna have to deal with it.
I don't know. I think maybe arguably you should open that up for another one then, since there were only 2 available.
Yeah, I mean, right? They have the right to take that from me whenever they want it, even without paying me for it. So that's fair. But no, that tier, in addition to me running a game for you, that also includes the previous stretch or the previous backer levels too, which means that you get to create an NPC and a village that I'll put into the setting. And the village is kind of cool because the Blackwood is so chaotic right now that when you create the village, before it goes into the final book, I'm going to roll a die and determine whether or not it's actually a ruin that you would have to recover from the wilderness before you can actually experience any stories in it.
And I was going to say, the 2 backer levels that allowed you to create NPCs and locations are already gone. So really, this is that last chance if you want to be immortalized as part of the Blackwood to get put your money where your mouth is and actually get something that's into the book.
Right. I will say, if we hear some demand for more of those levels, we can definitely open them up. But as of right now, we've taken up all of them. Yeah, people have scooped them up like hotcakes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's 25 days left. There's plenty of room to add.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have to admit, I get a little frustrated with Kickstarters that start adding additional price points in that didn't already exist, because now you're rewarding people who jumped on the boat late.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And that's
Expand the tiers. Yeah.
As a Kickstarter backer. Now, I have no problem with someone saying, "Hey, we sold a shit ton of this price level. I'm going to open it up and make more of them."
Yeah, expanding an existing tier I think makes a lot more sense than adding something late in the Kickstarter that a lot of your early adopters then go, "Oh, but I would have taken that."
Right.
I would have paid more for that.
Right. Well, and that's similar to our general Kickstarter philosophy too. Like in terms of adding new stuff, that's something we tried to avoid when we were making the Kickstarter. All the stretch goals and everything that people will unlock, with very few exceptions, are just going to unlock more art for the core book. We also have a stretch goal that would unlock a character sheet from Carl Kiesler, and we have a stretch goal that would unlock a separate PDF document. It's a collection of one-shot tales mixed with Blackwood-specific folklore. We've got a lot of guest writers signed on for that. And actually, one of our writers, her name's Eli Grauer, she has already submitted one of her stories to us, and it's friggin' awesome. It's not one of the adventures. It's just a piece of folklore. But the idea is that you could conceivably use it to create a one-shot for your players.
That's very cool. I was going to say, I know there's been kind of a push within a lot of PEG stuff lately with new licensees. They've really been pushing a lot of people to go more toward PDF and digital delivery, especially through Kickstarter. I noticed you're doing the drive-through RPG delivery. Is that something that you think you're going to get a good return on for the backers? Is that going to be a better experience for them rather than you having to send it off to a publishing house and get it shipped back to you and then out to the backers? Are they going to see a faster fulfillment through that?
Absolutely, yeah. So first of all, it's a lot easier for a backer to finally get the code and then go to Drive-Thru RPG on their own the same day and place the order than it is for me to finally get all of the printed books and to label each one of them individually and send them out individually. Like, they're going to save time by doing it this method, first of all. But then second of all, by doing fulfillment through Drive-Thru RPG instead of doing it myself, I don't have to charge them for all the production costs that go into that and all of the additional shipping costs and everything that go into that too. So even though with this situation, you're backing, $20 for the physical book, and then you have to pay a little bit extra for shipping and handling from Drive-Thru-RPG later, that's still going to be less overall than if I had done all the fulfillment myself.
Which gives you more of the Kickstarter funds to actually put into development and expanded stretch goals and better.
That printing
Absolutely.
and printing and shipping and warehousing books causes more publishing companies to actually lose money on any project, not just games, but any book, than anything else. It is hugely expensive.
Yeah. And so we're saving money for the backers by doing it this way. And, ultimately one day I might be okay with doing my own fulfillment or something, but this is my first Kickstarter project. I really wanted to focus on creating a good product and running a campaign that would grab people's attention. I just wouldn't have done a good job if I had tried to fulfill it myself this time. I don't mind admitting it. I would have bungled the crap out of that thing.
Well, and I mean, you also would have had a much higher goal for the Kickstarter if you had to have all those additional costs factored in.
Right.
So.
Exactly.
Right. Well, I think we live in enough of a digital age. I mean, anybody watching this is consuming it digitally. Anybody listening to what we're talking about is consuming it digitally on an iPhone or through a computer or through some kind of internet connection. I mean, I don't think that gamers are stuck in this analog world of it must be a printed book and I must have paper and pen. I mean, I understand that there's the need for that, the tactile sensation of, yes, I need a printed book, but you're providing that. You're just doing it through a digital delivery system, essentially. I mean, going through Drive-Thru as a digital clearinghouse. I don't see a problem with that at all.
Yeah. And they have a lot of experience with all sorts of fulfillment for every product imaginable. So we're in good hands with them,
Yeah, and I've gotten several books where I had Drive-Thru print them to print on demand. And actually, interesting side note, the Drive-Thru's print on demand fulfillment is done through a small warehouse in a little town called Laverne, Tennessee. The company's called Lightning Source. I know this to be fact because I wrote their software.
So if the page blurs, we can talk to Jib.
No, I didn't write
exactly.
But no, you won't get a blurred page because their printing is really good.
Yeah.
So, Eli, I know you had commented on this in chat. And I definitely want to touch on this because I think it's a big deal. Alec was asking some of their Kickstarters for Savage Worlds products, and I'm just going to go out on the limb and say some other Kickstarters for a lot of shit out there. It's just kind of a Kickstarter problem.
Yeah, not just Savage Worlds.
Are years behind schedule. What steps are you taking to make sure your product is delivered on time? And now my question that I'm going to kind of add on top of this, what do your backers get kind of as soon as the Kickstarter funds versus what do they get as you get closer and closer to those delivery times that you actually have set? Are they getting any kind of an immediate return?
Yeah, so first of all, let me answer your question. In terms of what backers get immediately after the campaign ends, as soon as they back, they have access to the working draft of the document. So they can see all the content, they can start playing if they want to. And when paired with all of our free products, like our Year in the Blackwood bundle, which is 6 pre-generated characters and 4 one-shot adventures, there's quite a bit of stuff you can do in the Blackwood while you're waiting for it to come out for the rest of your rewards to be delivered. And then the PDF would be coming out probably about a month or two before the physical copy would be coming out. So, and if you back to get anything, you back to get the PDF. It's included in every single tier. So you'd be getting the PDF a little bit sooner than you'd be getting your physical book, and then your physical book would be coming, like we say, in November at the latest. And then to answer the other question here, so first of all, I totally agree with you. Alec, thanks for asking the question. The first thing that I did was 2 years ago, I started researching how Kickstarters work. And for anybody who wants to start a Kickstarter, I cannot recommend you doing that enough. There are 2 resources in particular that have been extremely helpful for me. One of them is a free publication on Drive-Thru-RPG called The Sandbox. It's the first episode, or it's the first issue of this publication. and it's got a long article called Kickstarter Production Guidelines. And that tells you these are the steps you have to go through to have anything resembling a successful Kickstarter. It breaks down the research you have to do ahead of time. It breaks down how you need to organize your project in terms of like creating an art control sheet and contacting people a certain amount of time in advance and getting quotes and all that. So it's an excellent guide. The second thing that helped me learn how to run a Kickstarter is a Google Plus group called Kicksnarker. And it's a group of guys and gals who post ridiculous Kickstarters. There's one today that is basically a chopstick, a metal chopstick, but they're selling it as a tool to clean your ears in a way that is safe using screwdriver. This is an actual project on Kickstarter. And so this group Kicksnarker, they post these and they make fun of them. But they're also people who back a huge number of projects at any given time, so they're really familiar with the Kickstarter process. And so a week before I launched my campaign, I put it up as a draft on the Kickstarter community, and I was like, hey, tear this apart, guys. So they looked at it and told me what I needed to strengthen, what I needed to change, and that sort of thing. So this is all to say that research and preparation is 99% of the work when you're running a Kickstarter. Preparation is the one thing I haven't really touched on as much, but on that subject, the book is written. The Blackwood is entirely finished with the exception of a handful of adventures and some stat blocks that I need to fill in. So one of the problems that you face in a lot of Kickstarters is that the writing begins when it funds. And
Right.
It can take a lot of time to write something. And I mean, brain freeze happens, you know, you're not always going to have the creative flow. And it was really important to me that when we started the campaign, I could tell people, this book is finished. There's no question about me not being able to finish it before the deadline because it's done. All you have to do is help me make it beautiful and help me actually bring it into production.
Yeah. With the
go ahead,
project that I'm working on, I'm actually fronting the cost out of my pocket for my art, for my editing, for my layout. I'm doing it all out of pocket. So on the day that, if I get to that point, on the day the Kickstarter concludes, they've got a finished product.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason I would be getting money is to throw some extra money at my artists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you know, I understand where you're going or what you're going through too, because I have paid for quite a bit of stuff ahead of time in terms of getting, you know, layout and design done, getting some character archetype portraits created. If you look at the Kickstarter page, there's a really awesome half-page full-color image of two errants fighting a hollowback elf. That was drawn by one of our artists, Julia Metzger. I just could not be happier with it. I'm just, every time I see it, I want to weep happy tears.
So, and I just want to kind of throw this in there. How much of a process is this? When I know you said you've been researching Kickstarter alone for 2 years. How far back does the timeline go for when you did your elevator pitch to Pinnacle and went through the licensing agreement, and you know what's been kind of the road to the Blackwood been like for you? Because I know some people here in chat who know you personally, obviously, are even talking about, you know, the bouts of sickness that were brought on just by all the stress that has gone into creating this. So
man.
I assume this has been a bit of a highway.
I caught such a nasty cold 2 weeks ago. Oh man, it was the week before the Kickstarter was supposed to open, and I had a bunch of writing I had to wrap up, and I was like, okay, Saturday and Sunday I can just devote it to writing the whole time. I can get this knocked out. It's going to be awesome. But instead I had 100-degree fever and I felt miserable all weekend instead. So it wasn't ideal, but it's finished now, like I said. But anyway, so we finished the book about a week ago, felt really good. We became Pinnacle licensees in February. We started preparing our Pinnacle submission back in September or so. And we started officially developing the Blackwood for Savage Worlds maybe a year and a half ago at this point, year and a half, 2 years. But the roots of the Blackwood are way deeper than that. Basically, I moved to Chicago 6 years ago, And I moved from southern Missouri. That's this region of beautiful forests and all sorts of cool stuff. I was feeling really nostalgic. So I was like doing a lot of research about forests. I was doing a lot of research about my family history, mostly from Germany and from early America. And yeah, those were kind of the roots. And it was at first just research. And then it was at first just like, short stories and stuff that I was writing. And then I was like, no, I really want to make a game out of this. So like I said, 2 years ago or so, I said, okay, let's do this. I sat down with Savage Worlds, got to know it, and started writing. So yeah, that's the long and the short of the process. I could talk a little more specifically about the Pinnacle licensee process if you want.
Well, I know you recently had gotten a question regarding that on Google+. That's kind of what directed me to ask that. But now I guess the specifics I was more meaning is, kind of start to finish. I know a lot of people, when they see these Kickstarters go up, they're like, oh, well, I could sit down for 6 months and create this and throw it up on Kickstarter and make, $80,000.
Yeah.
Just how much of your life did you basically kind of lock away in a cupboard and forget existed so that you could get to this point today?
Yeah, well, I have a very understanding fiance. Thank you, Keely, for your patience. She could answer this question better than I could, but we had originally planned to launch this Kickstarter back in August. Whenever we sat down and started developing for Savage Worlds, we were like, okay, let's plan to do this in August of 2016. We can maybe get the book out before Christmas, and that could be pretty awesome. And it's just so much work. I mean, this is not my full-time job by any means. I have a full-time day job, and I'm also an actor here in Chicago. And so it's really difficult. And there were moments, maybe a week at a time when I would be like, okay, I just need to focus on this thing for like a whole week. Keely, I'm really sorry, but I'm feeling some pressure and I got to write a bunch of stuff. And then I was basically a hermit for a week. And so it was a mix of a lot of things, but overall, yeah, it's not an easy road. I think it's a universal experience among writers to go through periods of feeling awesome and feeling like you can't write to save your life. And I've been there. I've been there, but you got to push through it. I was having a conversation with a guy yesterday about how to write longer form material. And I agree with the advice from famous writers that says you just have to write and you just have to get into a writing habit. Personally, for me, it was really helpful to, for example, with all of the locations that I've written up in the Gazetteer. Those started off as bulleted lists of important things in each settlement. And then I expanded those bulleted lists to 100-word blurbs about each place. And then I was really burnt out on it. So I went and I worked on some monsters for a little while or something. And then when I got burnt out on that, I went and I worked on some adventures for a little while. And when I got burnt out on that, I would come back to settlements into like a 200 or 300-word entry each, And so, yeah, I guess that's a look into my process and the slow course of it over time.
Well, it's like what they say. What the main thing with writing is, you don't find time, you make it. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
You just have to dedicate to it. If you're going to write anything for publication, especially, it's a second full-time job.
Well,
you don't get paid for it. You just don't get paid for it.
I find for myself that if I were to wait for inspiration to write, I'd probably rarely write. But if I make it a point to write every day, then a lot of what I write is crap and it gets thrown away. But I'm much more likely to get something that's usable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and there's a lot of crap. I historically, like when I was in college, I would always procrastinate until the last minute, and then I'd just write whatever I could, and I never really understood the need for a revision. But now that I've had time to actually develop this thing, oh man, I mean, I've written each section 2 or 3 times at this point, and every time it gets a lot better, but you have to go through that crappy draft before you can learn what's good and what needs to change.
There is something to be said of sitting down and writing it up as if you were going to hand it to somebody as the final draft, and then rereading exactly what you wrote to realize just how much you need to revise it because you are a shitty author when you're writing the original draft versus the final.
Side question. How much playtesting have you done?
Yeah, so we had a year-long playtest campaign that's on YouTube. And it's playtesting in every sense of the word. As in episode number 1, I really wish people didn't have to start there because there are so many rulings that I gave wrong. And then like the first 2 or 3 episodes, almost every time I'm like, folks, last time I did this and it was the wrong thing to do. We're going to do it right this time.
So wait, I don't have to back the Kickstarter. I can just watch your YouTube series and I'll see the development of this.
Basically, yeah. And like even with that YouTube series, the first 2 episodes are pretty close to the plot point campaign, and then from then on it was more like, okay, well, I'm more on the tone thing at this point, and I'm coming up with cool things that can happen, because one of my design philosophies is that I don't want players to have to read a whole ton of stuff before they can actually play. I want to give players just enough information to get them started in their adventure, and then the rest of what they will learn about the world happens in the course of gameplay. I think, call me crazy, but role-playing games should be played.
Right.
So.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
So problem, drop on the table. All right. Figure out a solution.
There it is. Go for it.
Yep.
It does not take days and days and days to make characters.
Yeah. Well, and so to talk a little bit about something related to that, the beginning of the book, I think, is a pretty unique thing, or something that we haven't seen in a little while. I took inspiration from the Menser Redbox edition of first edition D&D, and it starts off with a solo adventure that's basically choose your own adventure, but you go off into the hills and you meet the female cleric and you get bitten by the snake and all that stuff. And it's a really cool way to introduce somebody to role-playing games if they're totally unfamiliar, because it tells you, this is what AC is. This is how you make an attack. This is how you roll damage. And it introduces you to the mechanics of the game as you're having fun reading a story. And so the Blackwood starts off with this little 10-minute solo adventure where you are a caravan guard on a forest road, and then all of a sudden an elf shows up and all hell breaks loose. And you have just enough time to take a few actions before the adventure comes to a close. You jump right into character creation, and then the first episode of the plot point campaign is a direct follow-up from that solo adventure that you went on at the beginning of the book.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. And that's something that the player can go through and doesn't even need the GM. It's fully written so you can kind of guide yourself through it.
Exactly. There are even like enemies attack you and you roll for the enemy, and it just tells you like if you roll above this number, then you roll this much damage for yourself.
Nice. Mm-hmm. All right. I don't have any other questions about. I think we've really thoroughly explored Blackwood and the Kickstarter.
Yeah.
This has been a great talk.
And I have to say, all kidding aside, guys, go out and back this. Make this happen. It's a great setting. I'm very interested in looking into it and trying to play it. A lot of stuff you've said tonight has really sparked my interest. So
I'm already plotting the campaign where I'm going to use it.
Yeah, the downfall of your players.
Always.
So I just want to add one thing, and it's a remarkable thing when I see people pull it off, and you've done it with the Blackwood, and it's something that I really want people to understand. The Blackwood, start to finish, including the plot point stuff that you have in it, is under 90 pages. This is not something that's going to be, this encyclopedic tome that they have to add that's bigger than Savage Worlds is itself. You've actually accomplished all of this in a very slight little book that they can add right to their already slight rule set.
Yeah, and I will say, the draft is about 80 pages right now. By the time we add pictures, it's probably going to be closer to 100. But still, like you said, this is not a tome. This is a pretty lean thing.
I do have one more quick question for you. when you do the print on demand
Sure.
copy, did you format it as digest size, or?
We are doing 8.5 by 11. We looked into digest size or something like that, but 8.5 by 11 is the most headache-free format, so that's what we went with.
And then I just like to add one thing. I think the prologue needs a little bit of editing. The calling Tolkien out as a blatant racist. I think maybe just a little too far. It's a little too far. But I understand
cultures are bullshit.
That's right. But when you have 101 degree fever, you tend to just it just tends to all come out. So on that note, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Chris, Dave, Eli, and Jib saying keep rolling and stay savage.